Resume the recording here. All right, folks. Well, welcome to yet another session of Lunch GPT. My name's Professor Kevin Frazier. I'm an assistant professor at St. Thomas University College of Law. And today it is my great honor to have a conversation with Mr. Tom Wheeler. Tom Wheeler is a businessman, author, and the former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. For over 4 decades, Wheeler has been involved with the telecommunications networks and services. Prior to being the chair of the FCC, he was the managing director of Core Capital Partners, a venture capital firm investing in early stage internet protocol based companies. One thing that's not in his bio, but is very important to point out, is that Tom is a wonderful mentor and friend to a litany of students from around the country. I remember my first meeting with Tom was in a very small office at the Harvard Kennedy School. And Tom, after just a 15-minute conversation, was kind enough to engage in a year's worth of exchanges of emails and random questions. So thank you very much for being here, Tom.
It's great to be with you, Kevin. And yes, that was a small room.
I'm not sure why they couldn't find a larger room, but we'll leave that for the Kennedy School folks to figure out down the road. Okay, so today we've got a bit of a packed agenda with some important topics. First things first, Anna, my research assistant, will put some of this information in the chat, but I wanted to make sure I highlighted it here first. Number one, it would be great if you all are on X, and I understand not everyone is on X these days. But if you're on X, please give us a follow. If you're not, please consider joining our Google group. It'd be great to have you in that forum so we can make sure you're up to date on the latest speakers and some articles that we may suggest you consider. And then the third thing I want you all to consider is helping us. Whether you're a student who may want to form a Lunch GPT chapter, or you're a faculty member who may want to get more involved with recruiting speakers and organizing these events, feel free to shoot me an email at kfrazier2@stu.edu. Unfortunately, we've only got 2 more Lunch GPT sessions for the remainder of this academic year, and then we'll go into a little bit of a summer lull as we continue to take a bit of a breather, and then we'll rally again for relaunching Lunch GPT in the fall of 2024. Okay, with those admin considerations out of the way, I'm just going to dive quickly through an outline of what we're going to do today. So first, I'll be talking a little bit about regulating AI and what's going on in around the world, actually, about efforts to regulate AI. Then we'll move into an interview with Tom, and then finally, you all get to pose some questions to our kind, esteemed guest. All right. Well, with that session outline set forth, let's dive into a couple things. So first things first, when we're regulating something, anything, we need to consider what risks are involved with that, with the subject of that regulation. So if you think to yourself, why don't we have any regulations around making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Well, are there very many risks posed by putting peanut butter and jelly on a sandwich? Well, not really, hence no need for regulation. So first, we need to think about what are the potential risks posed by AI? Well, there are two sorts of risks that have been identified so far. One would be these sorts of short-term risks, or what some people group into a category known as AI ethics. AI ethics, like the necessary and proper clause, is susceptible to a wide range of interpretations. So please do not take this as the definitive end-all be-all of what should be categorized as AI ethics or short-term risks. What's important to see is that a lot of these risks in a short-term perspective pertain to things like what is inherent to the technology itself. So we see some of the short-term risks posed by AI include things like algorithmic bias, relatedly, algorithmic discrimination. Other people have included things like dark patterns created by AI, as well as facial recognition, as among some of those more short-term AI ethics involved risks. Other risks on the other side of the spectrum would be long-term risks. So these sorts of risks are generally associated with misuse or abuse of the technology. In some ways, these are second-order effects of the use of AI. So you can think about an increase in cyber attacks as the one of the concerns of long-term AI use. Another would be dis and misinformation propagated or spread by AI, upending elections. And finally, another big category in long-term risk would be the proliferation and deployment of bioweapons made easier by things like ChatGPT and other large language models. So those are some of the risks that we have to think about addressing when we're regulating AI. And as you can tell, even something as simple as algorithmic bias, and then something as abstract and as important as bioweapons poses a lot of regulatory challenges. So to dive a little bit more into what those regulatory challenges are, I'd say there's a three big factors that make regulating AI really difficult. The first is the geographic scope. Before Threads was a thing, for lack of a better phrase, before Threads was a thing, we saw that ChatGPT had the fastest adoption rate of any technology. Within just a span of a couple of months, hundreds of millions of users were on ChatGPT. That geographic scope and that broad adoption makes regulating AI incredibly difficult because it makes it inherently an international effort, or at least one that's going to involve a lot of different stakeholders. The second and related challenge would be the speed with which AI is advancing and being deployed. So we have new labs, new models being created and spread every couple of weeks. We know that OpenAI and Meta are actively working on new models that will be released quite soon. And we know that in many cases, like with the release of Google's Gemini, the release of these models isn't necessarily something we can anticipate or expect. We may be given just a few weeks notice before some new model is released, and that model may have quite a few new advances that pose even more regulatory challenges. So the third factor, which hopefully comes as no surprise, would be its complexity, right? As Nathan covered during our last Lunch GPT session, AI is very complex. And the AI labs themselves are not always aware of how their own models work or the risks that these models may present. So two other factors just to keep in the background before we move on. One would be that surprise element, right? There's no requirement right now that Meta or OpenAI give us 6 months notice, 3 months notice, really any sort of notice prior to the release of a model. So that surprise factor is yet another regulatory challenge. One other would be uncertainty. We're just not sure what the long-term ramifications will be of the use of AI. And we're unsure of how quickly, for example, AI will be adopted and how it may eliminate or alter certain professions or just societal norms writ large. Okay, moving right along. So what are our options when it comes to regulating AI? Well, pardon a bad pun, but we're between a rock and a hard place when it comes to regulating AI. So here we have two broad categories of how best to regulate really anything, but in this case, how to regulate AI. One would be soft law, indicated by this kind teddy bear. So soft law is a variety of non-binding norms and techniques, which include instruments or arrangements that create substantive expectations that are not directly enforceable. All right, what the heck does that mean? This is the idea of things like voluntary codes, the use of the bully pulpit by the president, for example, or by members of Congress or by other regulators, public protests, all these sorts of mechanisms other than actual codified law to try to regulate the use of AI. Well then, in contrast, we have hard law regulations, and those are our standardized governmental rulemaking procedures and outcomes. So this is substantive law, statutes, codes that are enforceable against the AI labs. Okay, so a quick overview of the sorts of soft law and hard law mechanisms that have been developed so far. Well, what are the international efforts underway? There are quite a few. I'm going to focus just mainly on the UN. The UN has formed a high-level advisory board on artificial intelligence. So that's one mechanism they've gotten going. Obviously, that would fall into the soft law category. The UN General Assembly has also adopted a landmark resolution on the promotion of safe, secure, and trustworthy AI systems. Notably, 120 member states signed on to that resolution. And as you can see from this slide, the US and the UK have already taken action in that regard. So this UN resolution helps show that soft law can also inform hard law or further and promote hard law. So that's some of the international efforts underway. Next, we can see there are a range of domestic regulations going on. So many people regard the United Kingdom as the leaders in regulating AI. The regulation passed in the UK requires both high impact and general purpose AI models to adhere to a detailed set of transparency duties, as well as EU copyright regulations. So we can see that in the UK, they've already gone the hard law approach and have raised the bar for the rest of the countries to try to follow with respect to regulating AI. Well, the EU saw the UK try to take the lead, and the EU responded with the EU AI Act. So the EU AI Act, which is indeed quite a mouthful and hard to say, go ahead and practice at the end of the session. It adopts a risk-based approach for categorizing AI into 4 different tiers. It identifies certain risks, unacceptable risks, that are expressly prohibited under the Act. So that includes things like deepfake campaigns. In theory, you cannot launch any deepfake campaign without explicitly violating the EU AI Act. Another such unacceptable risk would be expansion of facial recognition schemes. But the category that probably is going to be the subject of most of the EU AI Act regulation will be these high-risk applications. So high-risk applications include biometric identification systems, educational systems, employment evaluation mechanisms, and insurance-related systems. So you can see this risk-based approach really coming to the fore with respect to the EU AI Act. So labs pursuing such activities have to register with the EU, have to install certain complaint quality mechanisms, and have to maintain adequate documentation and logs. China has also adopted some impactful and concrete regulations. We've seen its 2001 regulation on recommendation algorithms. Then in 2002, it passed a regulation for deep synthesis or synthetically generated content. And then in 2023, it issued some draft rules on generative AI. The US, in comparison, has yet to adopt formal hard law mechanisms or a comprehensive AI act, for example, akin to the EU. Instead, the most meaningful act taken by the federal government so far has been President Biden's executive order, which I'm sure we'll dive into in more detail in a second, but it is far too lengthy to explore fully in this session. All right, now what about the states? States can be clumped into 3 buckets right now. So one approach by states, taken by 12 different states, as a matter of fact, has been to just pass laws that require the state government to research AI and to report back at some future date to the governor or to the legislature about the best recommendations for how to regulate AI. 12 states have regulated how AI is going to be used in automated processing. So things like how companies may profile consumers. So we've seen that a lot of the focus of state regulatory energy has been on the privacy concerns of AI. And then a final bucket would be states passing regulation around the manipulation of media in the lead up to elections. So California, for example, has been a leader in this regard, trying to prevent the use of AI to further mis and disinformation in the advance of elections. Okay, that was a sprint. And I hope you all took diligent notes, but I really wanted to make sure we got to our conversation with Tom sooner than later. So, Tom, just from these headlines, my gosh, you've been busy.
Yes, well, one of the great things about being at Brookings is, you get they call it a think tank because you actually have time to sit around and think.
Yes, yes. And boy, have you been thinking. And I'm sure AI gives you quite a few opportunities to explore this in more detail. One thing I guess we should start with is some of the basics that I think our students would love to learn. So, what are some of the sources you tend to go to learn more about advances in AI? You know, what are the news sources you trust and look to for information about AI advances?
Wow, the challenge is it's like sitting at the base of a tsunami because the flood of AI related information that's exist. I did a thing like this yesterday, interestingly enough, with National Journal, which is a
Mm,
great publication tracking policy issues. And they have now started, I think, probably what is the best answer to your question. They have now started a bi-weekly, if that means I always get this confused, a twice a week online summary of big news events and the ability to then go to the documents behind it.
mm.
And that's going to be life-saving in many ways.
That's excellent. We'll have to try to find that and spread that to the Lunch GPT community. And you're right; it is certainly difficult just to stay in stay ahead of not only what AI advances are coming down the pike, but also how regulators are responding.
Right.
So we'll get to that in a little more detail in 1 second. One thing I'm curious to know is to what extent you find yourself using AI. Has it become something that's a regular occurrence for you? Is
Yeah.
it akin to a Google search at this point where, you know, it's just muscle memory? Or are you
Well, no,
still
it's a
kind of
lot.
getting
No, it's
adjusted
a
to it?
lot more than a Google search. That's for sure. I use it. I love it to stimulate ideas, to try
Mhm.
and find relationships. I mean, I used it literally 2 days ago, back up at Harvard, where you and I met, and I asked it the question: relate Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon with the Digital Markets Act in the EU.
Wow.
Now, there's kind of an off the wall query. And the point of the matter is what I was fishing for is transformational government processes that we all talk about. Well, you've crossed the Rubicon because it was a transformational moment
Mm,
in world history. I think that the Digital Markets Act that the EU has come up with is similarly a transformational effect in moving from industrial era regulatory oversight to digital era. And so I
mm.
played a little around with that with GPT-4.
Nice. That is in excellent use. As my students will, or I guess I'll share a secret with some of my students. Some of my awful jokes originate from Chat GPT-4. I go to it usually for some bad humor. I think they're funny. But all right, fascinating. Well, let's dive into kind of a conception of the risks. So earlier I talked about this framing of AI ethics and AI safety, or perhaps more abstractly, short-term risks versus long-term risks. So without going into a binary over which are more important, I'd love to learn more about which risks are top of mind for you right now, and then we can dive into some specific manifestations of those risks.
Well, I organize it a little differently. I think that the risks of AI are first built around losing control of the algorithm so it does bad things. And those are all the apocalyptic scenarios that we all hear about. And second is losing control of humans use of AI to do bad things. And so, throughout, you talked about the EU AI Act and how it's a risk-based analysis. I think that the risk analysis starts with this question, because certainly we need to be concerned about, aware of, putting expectations on the cutting edge frontier models and where they're going. But if we allow ourselves to become overwhelmed by the apocalyptic potential, we're going to miss what is being done to affect humans on a day-to-day basis.
Hmm.
And so that's how I parse the risks. And then on the second risk, if you will, I think it is exacerbated by open source AI.
Mhm.
That you can get your arms around the frontier models and say, we need transparency, we need audits, we need red teams, we need yada, yada, yada. But open source AI, and literally in the last 24 hours, I think it was, I'm sorry, Meta has released Llama 3, which is, in one flavor, has a 70 billion parameter model and has released it to open source. And once you've got AI in the wild, the idea of how do you control that model floats out the window. So again, you've got to come back. I think so. I wrote a book after I left the commission called From Gutenberg to Google: The History of Our Future. And one of the key takeaways of that book is that it's never the primary technology that is transformational, but it's secondary impacts. And so, to answer your question, when you look at those two choices that you have on the page, I think we need to pay a lot of attention to the secondary impacts.
Mhm. And with respect to this open sourcing that's going on and the making available these huge models and these very powerful models, how do you think about a sort of corporate responsibility mentality for what we've seen Meta do, really embracing this open sourcing, releasing models into the wild, as opposed to a company like Anthropic trying to really make sure they're developing AI in a responsible manner? I wonder if you see them being true to those missions. So Anthropic really being true with respect to only creating models that are responsible or can be safely used, and comparing that to Meta's idea that we need to democratize, in as some folks have said, democratizing AI by releasing these open models. How do you kind of sort through their respective corporate
How long is
responsibilities?
this session, Kevin? So
You've got a bit.
so
We've got about
so let's
25 more minutes before Q&A.
let's talk. So first of all, I am pro competition, and one of the great things about uh, open source AI is that it is fiercely competitive. I am pro innovation, because one of the things that flows from competition is innovation, and that's what the various open models are doing. At the same point in time, you need to have oversight of the effects of those activities. And so this is why I go back. I'm not going to make judgments about Anthropic versus Meta or whatever the case may be. Um, but one of them has set themselves up so it is a single neck to ring, if you will, or a specific operation to look at. Whereas the other has said, "Hey, let 1,000 flowers bloom," and I'm worried about the pollen from those 1,000 flowers,
Especially if you've got an allergy to pollen, that's going to prove
which
problematic.
you may have heard me sniffling in the background here.
Spring can be a rough one. Well, with respect to Meta and to kind of segue into a risk I think you've identified and focused on more so than some other folks would be the use of AI in the metaverse. So, can you tell us why this is a particular concern of yours?
Well, it's really interesting. Before AI captured the headlines, it was the metaverse. Mark even changed the name of his company, and and then all of a sudden the metaverse disappears, but it didn't, because
It's still there.
all it is the application of AI. And so the point that I was trying to make in that piece that you showed the headline from the slide back is to say that, hey, um, the issues that are raised by AI are core issues to the metaverse as well. And let me go back even one further step. One of my favorite quotes, Tristan Harris
Hmm.
wrote a piece in an op-ed in the New York Times in which he said that social media was humanity's first interaction with AI, and humanity
Hmm.
lost. And I think that that's something we need to keep in mind, whether it is the metaverse or whether it is social media or whether it is what the deliverables, the effects of AI are going to be. That and this goes back to your, in essence, self-regulation question. You know, I mean, I fear that self-regulation is an illusion. And
Hmm.
I'm the guy, by the way, who oversaw writing the self-regulatory code that the wireless industry uses. And what I learned from that process is that self-regulation has two weaknesses. The first is that it is only as strong as the weakest link of those who are coming up with the standard. And that means you get to the very bottom of what is needed. And secondly, it has no enforcement. So what are you going to do? You're not obeying the voluntary code. Yeah. So what? And so that's why I believe in the need for regulation, but I also believe in that in the digital era, the way in which we look at that regulation and the way in which we structure that regulation needs to be different from how it was in the industrial era. And since I've been sitting here pitching my books, my latest book is one called Techlash: Who Makes the Rules in the Digital Gilded Age? And it specifically addresses this issue as a former regulator, or as somebody called me the other day, a recovering regulator. Um, how do we deal with the necessary public interest oversight in a world in which the industrial oversight model, it doesn't work anymore?
Hmm. Well, and I think what's particularly interesting too is to see that a lot of these secondary effects that you're discussing, such as the use of AI in the metaverse, or as Meta announced with that Llama 3 announcement, integrating AI into pre existing platforms to an even
Right,
greater extent than is already true. For
right,
folks who haven't seen the headlines or read about Llama 3, Meta is planning on allowing influencers and more or less create AI chatbots that can perfectly impersonate them on their social media accounts. So you may not be interacting with that brand ambassador for Nike or whomever. It could actually be a chatbot who has been trained on that influencer's voice and diction and all of those things. And so we are entering this era of synthetic social media. So I think that's going to unleash yet another can of worms as we try to sort through this murkiness of how to regulate, whom to regulate, and when to regulate. And I think, Tom, I'm keen to know also, you come across this a little bit, surely, well, a lot of it in the telecom space, but one particular concern with respect to AI has been the national security ramifications of a sort of race with China and other potential adversaries. How much is that a factor, you think, in our haste or lack thereof with respect to regulating AI?
Well, I think there's two ways to look at that, Kevin. The first is that yes, we need to be concerned about this, and we need to make sure that we are putting the resources as a nation into the development of AI, and that doesn't only mean private resources. And second, I have concern that the companies who are dominant in AI have been dominant in for the last 25 years in digital media, and have used the argument, oh, you can't regulate us, you can't break us up because we'll lose to China. And so the boogeyman that the dominant players, the China boogeyman that the dominant players hide behind, saying you need us to be able to compete with China. And at the other end of the spectrum, the realization that yes, there is real competition here. There are real national security issues here, but they need to be dealt with by the national security apparatus more than by a handful of companies who say, let us make the rules that just happen to benefit ourselves.
Yeah, it's certainly we've seen that the ramifications of these technological advances have had very tangible effects on national security concerns. Obviously, Facebook inciting certain riots and election interference. Now, thinking about that being amplified is certainly cause for concern. But I agree that this is a practice of thinking about who has the institutional capacity and mandate to actually regulate these areas. With that in mind, let's move on to our next area here. Let me get this going. Okay. So with this kind of idea, oh, did it move? Okay. So with this idea of who should regulate, I'm really keen to get your sense of the proper mix of stakeholders in our US context with respect to Congress, the executive, and agencies. Obviously, we've already talked quite a bit about soft law and voluntary commitments or self-governance. But what do you think in particular about agency capacity to take on this highly technical, highly evolving regulatory challenge?
Well, let me first say that that the regulators who have responsibility have the responsibility for some aspects of AI today. And my concern is not all aspects of AI today. I mean, you look at Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission, for instance. I mean, I've got the greatest respect for the job that Lena is doing and for the job of the staff of the FTC. But you got to understand that this is an agency that was created in 1914 and is existing under a statute that doesn't quite give them the flexibility that one would wish to deal with. And in matter of fact, in the 70s in the Magnuson-Moss Act, Congress specifically went in and tried to constrain the flexibility of the FTC. So, but let me back up and see if I can approach this from another angle. The government can parse the challenges caused by the effects of AI in multiple ways. First of all, um, those things that were illegal in the analog world are illegal in the digital world. Start there, okay? Fraud, discrimination, etc. Um,
Mhm.
that and that, Lena has this great line where she says there's no AI exemption to existing law. Spot on. All right. So we got the structures to deal with things that have always been bad that are just made better. I was an English major.
Nice.
Um,
Yeah, I can
and
tell.
and so that's kind of level one. Level two, however, is we get to a situation where there are things that we have been sweeping under the rug for the last quarter of a century. Privacy. What's competition look like in a digital environment? Truth and trust, these kinds of issues, which have a dual role in AI, where they were important to the creation of the models, the LLMs. You know, they're based on your and my private information in many ways, right? They are having a competitive impact without oversight. They're affecting truth and trust, and 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 we haven't dealt with these issues on the most basic level for the last 25 years. And so we've got to deal with that fact that we haven't established the baseline. And
Mhm.
then we go to the kind of things you were talking about before, the great term, the unknown unknowns. Um,
Yes.
we we have no idea what's coming next, but we can be absolutely certain that something is. And how do we put in place a structure that is expert enough and agile enough and has
Mhm.
tools enough to deal with these kinds of unknown challenges as they come up? And you can't turn to Congress and say, hey, Congress, here's a new thing, let's deal with it. I mean, our Congress hasn't dealt with AI. And you need to have a structure that is in place and tasked with this. And interestingly enough, this is what Senators Angus King and Mitt Romney and some others just proposed earlier this week. And then lastly, let me just touch on the president's executive order. I
Mhm.
mean, my goodness, 111 pages of work. And the thing that having been in the government, what nobody really recognizes is how hard it is to get consensus inside the government, and the fact that in a 6 month period, this administration could bow its back to this challenge and come up with this set of recommendations, which is principally what it is. We recommend for various agencies and others what they ought to be doing, but then also to find the teeth in the Defense Production Act that says to the frontier models, this is what is expected of you. And it is a lesson in good government in terms of what you can do in 6 months when you bow your back. It is also a lesson in terms of how limited the power of the presidency is, because the only things that he really had executive authority, presidential authority over, are those things that are covered in the Defense Production Act, which have national security and national economic effect. And that was very limited. And even when he did that, he got serious pushback from some of the folks on the Hill. So Congress
Right.
needs to step up and do something here. Um, and um, and the challenge that they're having doing it goes back to that different levels of activity that I was talking about.
Well, so, in the off chance that somehow Congress doesn't hear your call for action, just in the off chance, and we continue to see states pursue this regulatory route. We had in one of our earlier conversations with Professor Rubenstein and Senator Maroney from the state of Connecticut discussing some state efforts to regulate AI. Do you fear this concern of creating a sort of privacy patchwork 2.0 where we get states just coming up with all these different models and that inhibiting the sort of innovation we were talking about earlier? Or would you encourage states to try to be these laboratories of democracy to help Congress out?
Boy, you have just hit on a hot button of mine, Kevin. Um,
I'm glad to do it.
the 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 failure of the Congress of the United States to deal for the last couple of decades with these issues has stopped the United States from being the global leader that it traditionally has been to address new technological challenge. We're dealing now with the first time in American history that we have not responded with a set of expectations related to new technologies.
Mm.
And nature abhors a vacuum, right? So into that vacuum, rush, as you said on an earlier slide, the EU, the UK, China, because we're not acting. And so somebody else is making the rules that in an interconnected world means that they're ending up making rules for us.
Hmm.
And then the other place where the void gets filled is, as you just pointed out, at the state level. And God bless the states for acting because the federal government certainly isn't acting and something must be done. But let's remember that the reason the United States Constitution was written was a result of the Annapolis Convention when the states, the under the Confederation, were enacting rules that were hurting the ability to have commerce amongst the states. And so if we end up with a patchwork quilt of different requirements, it's going to set us back in our ability to both exploit and develop AI. And now let's go back to the national security question. I mean, this is a we need to step forward and exert some American leadership in the policy space. And unfortunately, we have failed to do that for the last quarter century.
Well, that's certainly sounds like a hot button, and I totally agree that the failure of Congress to fulfill its role to have this sort of effective government was the problem we were trying to solve in the transition away from the Articles of Confederation. And I think another central insight to the failure of the Articles of Confederation was that absence of a strong centralized government
Right.
being able to respond to crises. And as much as I'd love to chat your ear off about why we should reform the Administrative Procedure Act to free up some agencies to be more agile, that would be a 3 hour conversation and probably put some of our attendees to sleep. So we'll save that for the next time we get together. One thing I do want to flag before we go to some questions from the audience would just be some of the overlooked questions you've also pointed out. One in particular would be the digital divide. We talked at a conference a couple of months ago about how conversations about the digital divide have, like our conversations about the metaverse, seemingly disappeared. Everyone's focused on AI, and yet the need to make sure that everyone has access to robust internet to be able to use AI hasn't been at the front of the agenda as much as we saw, for example, during the pandemic. So, can you talk a little bit more about why the digital divide is still highly relevant?
Well, the digital divide was originally defined in terms of you had access to the internet and you did, or you didn't. Now you've got issues such as, yes, do you have access? And there's that $40 billion the federal government is spending to connect those who are unconnected. But also then, what can you do once you get there? Do you have the equipment? Do you have the training? Um, and um, and I mean, I'll now have a bit of a commercial that next Thursday the FCC is going to vote to reinstate net neutrality.
Mhm.
Something that we did in 2015 when I was chairman of the Trump administration eliminated. And then there's a very basic digital divide question there, and that is that there is a bottleneck of a handful of players between your home and small businesses and the rest of the internet, such as large language models.
Mhm.
And will there be basic rules requiring just and reasonable behavior and non-discriminatory access, or will there be a new divide that those who control that last mile are able to impose?
Mm. Certainly going to remain relevant, especially with respect to that literacy component as well. If we're not seeing folks learn how to use these tools, we've already seen folks misuse them. Most lawyers, I think, have heard about the Mata example where a lawyer just assumed that ChatGPT was an expert on the Montreal Convention. Turns out that wasn't the case. So a kind reminder that you need to be responsible with the use of these tools. Well, with that, I think hopefully we have some questions from the audience. I see we've already got one question here. Let's go to Professor Rubenstein. Go ahead, David.
You so much, Mr. Wheeler. This is just such an honor. I'm just, we're new with this lunch chat GPO program, but you are such a headliner. I just want to thank you personally for this. Is just amazing, and I hope our students and everybody appreciates this.
Blame it on Kevin. It's all his fault.
And I love, yeah, right. I'll leave it to Kevin to come up with such a wonderful program. So first, I just wanted to start just a little bit about how wonderful it is that you are the person speaking just in general, not just to us, but to policymakers. And just, you'll correct me if this is unfair for me to say, but obviously you have a background as a regulator, but a regulator of a different generation, let's say, where light touch regulation by default, or certainly as a first preference, certainly of a different generation than Alina Khan, let's say. And this is not to say that one approach is right or the other, but the fact that you so heavily recognize the value of innovation, because you sort of, that's where your roots are, and even self-regulation to a point, and to have you come forward and say that AI is different, that even someone from your background, that regulation of some type is maybe necessary because of the potential risks, and because our existing laws, they go so far, but maybe not everything that needs to happen. So again, you can tell me if that's an unfair characterization, but that's just an extended way of my appreciation for the work you're doing. I have your book that is on the top of my list for this summer. And now my question.
Great. Thank you.
Now my question. One of the things that you know so well is that it's so fascinating, right? But which is just, it's so fascinating. But it's so complicated because all of these pieces are interrelated in so many complex ways. And so I'm going to ask you one of these like higher level questions that connect many things that you talked about: innovation, self-regulation, the China narrative, gridlock, existing laws on the books, national security, and the executive order. And so here's the question. So you have all these pressures causing gridlock, which is politicized to begin with. But then there's a good argument that we don't want to stifle the industry because of the innovation, which is an argument for self-regulation. And if that's not enough, then as you said, we just throw in the China Trump card. We can't regulate, God forbid, because then China will take over the world, right? So all of that is certainly not helping the gridlock situation. But then you also said that national security is a real concern, but we have to not have that be a trump card, or at least we need to separate national security from things that are more domestic, things that reasonable, responsible regulations that seem like they're fitting. But then now turning to the executive order, what's interesting is that because of the gridlock, what's going to be happening, this is also true of the FTC, but everywhere, but like just sticking with national security, are you concerned about like creep in the sense that we have national security laws that are very generous on the books, like the Defense Production Act, which is like where you're going to see the president or the executive branch, because Congress is not passing laws, dipping into what are essentially national security related laws to require things like transparency of the industry. So on the one hand, you have industry saying, don't, go into Congress behind the scenes, if not on the internet, just saying, don't regulate us, don't regulate us, don't regulate us, so we don't get new laws. And then when the executive clearly needs to do something to get some transparency, uses a law on the books because that's the only thing that's available, and it happens to be a national security law. Now you have industry saying that you can't do that either. And it's like, it seems like the industry wants it all which ways. And I just want to know what you think about any
Oh,
or all of that.
what a surprise.
Mhm.
I used to love when I was chairman that the industry would come in and say, oh, regulation stifles innovation and investment. And old style, and this is what hopefully you find in the book when you read it this summer, Techlash, that I say, yeah, old style industrial regulation does that. So here's what we're going to do. And I tried it in 3 different ways when I was chairman of the FCC. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to move away from that, and we're going to try and have a more agile approach to regulation. We did it in cybersecurity, we did it in the open internet, and we did it in privacy. All of them got dumped at the request of the industry by the Trump administration. And what they did at that point in time was the response to that was, oh, you can't do that. That's regulatory uncertainty. So here you have on one end strict regulation, which is bad, and then agile regulation, which is bad, which means really we want no regulation at all. Let us make the rules. And these things are just too damn important. And we need to have the public interest being identified and a structure put around how to create and enforce that public interest.
Okay, we have time for, I think, one more question, and we've got a question from Jose. So, Jose, would you like to pose your question? Wow. Well, I think that was maybe one of the most comprehensive lunch GPT sessions we've had to date. And we owe it all to you, Tom. Thank you so much for coming. I know everyone's loudly clapping in the background. I've learned a lot today. I'm sure students took a lot away today. And we're honored to have you here. And perhaps we'll have you again down the road to talk through, I'm sure, what will be just the unknown unknowns that are surely going to become
They're coming.
known. Yes, exactly. But thank you so much again, Tom, and everyone else. Please be sure to join us next week when we have Mark Williams from Vanderbilt talking about the use of AI and legal services, which will be quite fascinating. So thanks again, Tom, and to the rest of you all, see you soon.
Thanks, Kevin.